The British called him the most honourable enemy they ever fought. Churchill praised him in Parliament while their armies were still killing each other in the desert. Today the largest base in the German army still carries his name. And yet in 1944 Adolf Hitler had him killed. Erwin Rommel is the general everyone agrees was one of the good ones, the proof that a decent man could serve inside a criminal army. Whether that is true is the question this video is built around, and the answer says something uncomfortable about the whole of the Wehrmacht. Rommel was born in 1891, the son of a schoolteacher. That detail matters because the German officer elite came almost entirely from old Prussian aristocracy, and Rommel belonged to none of it. Everything he earned on the battlefield. He proved that in the First World War. At the Battle of Caporetto in 1917, he slipped a handful of men through the Italian lines and by his own account, took around 9,000 prisoners while losing almost none of his own. For that he received the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest award for bravery, an honor that was almost never handed to an officer so junior. The man who would become the Desert Fox learned his trade on foot, long before he ever sat inside a tank. This is the part the later legend prefers to forget. Rommel did not rise by standing against Hitler, he rose by standing close to him. In 1937 he published a classic book on infantry tactics, and it brought him to the attention of the very top of the regime. A year later he was given command of the battalion that escorted Hitler on his travels, a posting that placed him physically at the dictator's side. And it went beyond ambition. In these years Rommel wrote that the Wehrmacht was the sword of the new German worldview, and after a visit to Switzerland he noted with approval that the soldiers there showed understanding for what he called our Jewish problem. Politically, Rommel was anything but neutral, and he shared a great deal of the worldview of the regime he served. When Hitler prepared to invade France in 1940, something strange happened. Rommel had spent his entire career in the infantry and the mountain troops. He had never led tanks in battle, and during the invasion of Poland he had not even commanded a fighting unit, only the security detail at Hitler's headquarters. The army's personnel chief wanted to give him a mountain division to match that background, but Rommel wanted something else entirely. He asked Hitler in person for a panzer division, the most modern and most coveted command in the army, and any other officer with so little experience would have been laughed out of the room. Rommel got it in February 1940, simply because he stood high in the Führer's favor. That is how an infantry officer with no tank experience ended up at the head of the 7th Panzer Division. To everyone's surprise, he turned out to be made for the job. In May 1940, he crossed the Meuse, broke through the French lines and raced toward the coast at a speed that even his own high command could not follow. Nobody knew exactly where he was, which is how the unit earned its nickname, the Ghost Division. In 6 weeks, France had fallen, and Rommel was the hero of the German press. Underneath that brilliant advance lies a darker story. In the very areas where his division fought, French prisoners of war were murdered, above all black colonial soldiers from Africa, shot after surrendering purely because of the color of their skin. Here, honesty matters. The historian Raphael Scheck found no evidence that Rommel personally ordered these executions, but he also establishes that Rommel's division operated where such killings were common and was probably responsible for the executions at Hangest-sur-Somme. The celebrated advance and the murder of defenseless prisoners happened on the same map in the same days. In 1941, Hitler sent him to North Africa, and it was there that the legend was truly born. Rommel drove the British back hundreds of kilometers and earned from his enemies the nickname that would stay with him forever, the Desert Fox. It was the enemy that built his reputation because the British needed a brilliant opponent to explain away their own defeats. Out of this grew the most famous claim about the entire campaign, that North Africa was a war without hate, a chivalrous fight far from the horrors of the rest of Europe. There is a kernel of truth in it. Rommel generally treated captured enemy soldiers correctly, and he refused to allow Waffen-SS units onto his front, but that elegant phrase hides far more than it reveals. A month after Rommel arrived, the SS officer Walter Rauff came to North Africa as well, one of the designers of the mobile gas vans used to murder people in Europe. Behind Rommel's front, Jewish men were rounded up and put into forced labor camps, and had Germany taken Egypt, a killing squad stood ready to do there what the Einsatzgruppen were doing in the east. Recent research by the historian Patrick Bernhardt has demolished the phrase war without hate, documenting executions of prisoners and racially motivated murders of Arabs, Berbers, and Jews. Rommel did not pull the trigger himself, and even so, his front was anything but clean. The relative calm there had less to do with decency than with geography, because far fewer Jews lived in the region than in occupied Europe. The legend of the unbeatable desert fox came to an end in 1942 at El Alamein. Facing Rommel now was the British General Montgomery, with roughly twice as many men and an overwhelming advantage in tanks and aircraft, and Rommel was beaten. When he tried to pull his troops back to save them, Hitler ordered him to stand and fight to the death, and Rommel ignored the order and withdrew anyway. Militarily, that was the right call, and it is exactly the kind of moment the myth would later feed on, although the quarrel was about tactics rather than about the war itself, and afterwards Rommel went on serving loyally for almost 2 more years. After the defeat in Africa, Hitler gave him command of Army Group B in early 1944, responsible for the coastal defenses from the Netherlands down to the Loire. Here Rommel showed that he was more than a lucky daredevil because he had a sharp grasp of what was coming. He understood that the Allies would command the air completely, and that this would make it impossible to move German reserves once the invasion had begun. His conclusion was clear. The Allies had to be defeated on the beaches themselves in the first hours, before they could establish a foothold. He threw his characteristic energy into it, having millions of mines laid, covering the beaches with obstacles and planting angled stakes in the fields against landing gliders, stakes that soon earned the mocking name Rommel's asparagus. On one point, he lost the internal argument, and it would cost the Germans dearly. Rommel wanted the panzer reserves close behind the coast, ready to strike within hours, while Field Marshal von Rundstedt wanted them held deep inland for one great counterattack. The compromise that followed satisfied no one and left the tanks too far away to make a difference on D-Day, and Rommel's judgment turned out to be the correct one. Around this time, he also began to grasp what many officers already believed, that the war was lost. On the 17th of July 1944, Rommel's staff car was strafed by Allied fighters and he was severely wounded in the head. 3 days later, a bomb went off under Hitler's conference table in the most famous attempt on the dictator's life, and Rommel lay unconscious in a hospital while it happened. How large his role in that plot really was remains fiercely disputed, but the evidence points to something far smaller than the legend claims. Rommel wanted Hitler gone, yet he was against an assassination, fearing that a dead Hitler would become a martyr. His name still came up during the hunt for the conspirators, and for a national hero, Hitler wanted no public trial, so he chose a quiet solution instead. On the 14th of October, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's house with a choice. He could face a trial that meant certain death and the persecution of his family, or he could take a cyanide capsule and be given a state funeral while his family was left in peace. Rommel chose the poison to save them. The German public was told that he had died of his wounds, and he was given a state funeral by the very regime that had just had him killed. It is here, with his death, that the story really begins, because the Rommel most people know was assembled after the war, and the legend had 2 fathers. The first was Goebbels, who inflated him into a shining war hero. The second was the enemy, because the British built their opponent up into a knight. After the war came the decisive layer, and admiring British biography, the publication of his war papers, and in 1951 a Hollywood film with Rommel as the noble field marshal. Together they built an image resting on 3 pillars, that Rommel was no real Nazi, that he was a military genius, and that the war in Africa had been clean. That image arrived at exactly the right moment. The Cold War suddenly left the Western Allies needing a rearmed West Germany against the Soviet Union, and you cannot build a new German army if the old one is remembered as a band of criminals. So the reputation of the Wehrmacht had to be washed clean, and Rommel became the figurehead of that effort. The message was that the army had simply done its honourable duty, and that the crimes belonged to a handful of SS fanatics. That is the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, and Rommel is its shining poster. So does the myth of the clean Wehrmacht hold up? It does not. At the level of the army as a whole, it is simply false. The Wehrmacht was deeply complicit in war crimes and in genocide, above all on the Eastern Front, on a scale the world has rarely seen, and the idea that only the SS had dirty hands is a post-war lie that was told because it was politically convenient. Rommel himself was more complicated than either caricature. He was an exceptionally gifted commander who usually treated enemy soldiers correctly and refused some criminal orders, and at the same time he was a loyal supporter of Hitler for years. He let himself be used by the propaganda machine, and his troops fought where defenseless prisoners were murdered. Rommel does not prove that the Wehrmacht was clean. He was an ambiguous man who was chosen by others to make a lie believable. The desert fox was a great soldier, but history is not a list of great soldiers. It asks what you put your talent toward and in whose service, and on that question, Rommel's answer is far less reassuring than the myth has been telling us for 70 years. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss anything. See you next time.